everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is David Viorst of Relay Station Social Media, and I'm the co-chair of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society. The Internet Society, as I'm sure many of you know, is a global organization that is on the forefront of maintaining a free and open Internet. Our mission at the D.C. chapter is to take that and put it into action in D.C. We are really enthusiastic about today's event, about having Ambassador Kramer here in his first public appearance since Dubai. I want to thank a lot of people, particularly UJ Sophia from American University for helping us put this together and providing this wonderful venue. I'd also like to thank the ambassador's staff, particularly John Alden, who's worked with me for maybe 3-4 months making sure this happened. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and I'd like to thank our incredible panel. Our moderator, Laura DeNardis, noted internet governance scholar, author, and professor here at AU, will be the moderator. She will be introducing the panel. I'd like to invite all of you to become active in our chapter and in the Internet Society. Would all the people from the chapter here please stand up or raise your hands if you're working the video? Great, you can see any of us at any time. We're going to be engaging in some very exciting projects in the upcoming months and year, and we welcome all of your participation. Without further ado, let's get started. Laura, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. My name is Laura DeNardis, and the purpose of this panel is to debrief and to discuss the recent World Conference on International Telecommunications held in Dubai. Thank you very much to the Internet Society's Washington, D.C. chapter for organizing this important event. I also want to welcome our large internet viewing audience. I know that there's considerable attention to this and interest. The hashtags for this event will be ISOC-DC and also hashtag WCIT, WCIT. As you know, 193 member states convened to discuss updating the treaty known as the International Telecommunication Regulations, or ITRs, which was developed in 1988 and designed to determine how telecommunications operators would interact both technically and financially across national borders. Now, the treaty, as you also know, is administered by the International Telecommunication Union, an agency of the United Nations, which convened this meeting in Dubai to discuss updating the treaty. There has been considerable media attention, considerable controversy, both about the proposals leading into the event and also the event itself and the outcomes of the meeting. Now, the purpose of this panel, as I see it, is threefold. It's to explain what was at stake in the deliberations in Dubai, to analyze the outcome of the deliberations and what it might mean for both internet governance and internet freedom. And I hope also that the panel will flag key issues and concerns going forward that we should be aware of. So I'm delighted to be moderating, and I'd like to introduce our panel. I'll introduce everyone, and then I'll explain what the format will be. We are very fortunate to have the Honorable Terry Kramer, U.S. Ambassador, who was head of the delegation to the World Conference on International Telecommunications. He's, of course, at the U.S. Department of State. We also have Sally Wentworth, who is a Senior Manager of Public Policy at the Internet Society. Welcome. Hi. We have Harold Feld, who is the Senior Vice President at Public Knowledge, and we will also be joined by Jay Becky Burr, Deputy General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer at New Star Inc. So the format will be, we'll start off with some remarks by the Honorable Terry Kramer, and then we will have some remarks by the panel, followed by a period of question and discussion. So thank you very much for being here, and without further ado, I would like to welcome the ambassador to come up and give some remarks.
So good morning to everybody. Laura, thank you for that kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here. As Laura mentioned, this is the first formal public engagement I've had since getting back. Many of you asked if I'm jet lagged. I am jet lagged, but I've been so tired I sleep on demand. So I actually don't know the term jet lag anymore. But this is a unique opportunity for us to talk about the wicket, what our expectations were going in, what played out when we were there, and most importantly, what is the going forward implications? Because I think that this is part of a long-term discussion and advancement that needs to happen, and I think having that discussion is a very important one. And what I'd like to start out talking about is where I see the successes from the conference. There's no question there were notable challenges and a very interesting set of developments with proposals that came from China, Russia, a variety of the Arab states that very much changed the complexion of the conference to the adverse, candidly. But if you put that aside for a second and say what were the overall objectives we had and what things were achieved, I'd like to cover the positive aspects first of all and then get into what are some of the implications of the various proposals. And there were 4 areas that I would call out as successes, again, in this context that we operated in at the wicket. The first thing was there was a very explicit discussion leading up to the conference, during this conference, and actually right after, that's going to be starting now, about the criticality of internet freedom. This was an explicit discussion. It was a discussion about what success looks like. It was a discussion about implications, etc. So that's the first thing that I'd like to cover in more detail as I share my comments. The second thing is the actual treaty that 89 nations did sign up to, actually on the telecom arena side, wasn't anywhere near as bad as we feared. There were some actually very positive elements that came out of that, again, that I'd like to cover with you. The third thing is we had a chance to have some broader discussions about what we think are future models for success for the internet, and specifically the importance of liberalized markets, markets that are open to a variety of providers of broadband communications, and also the importance of multi-stakeholder governance, not from a theoretical standpoint, but an actual specific one. And I trust and believe all of you at the Internet Society know how critical your role is, because if I think of organizations that were critical to our preparation and examples, role models of what we're talking about, the Internet Society would be one of the first that I would come up with. The final thing I'd mention is the success is the role of civil society. The impact, the messaging, the awareness of civil society and what role they have in this discussion came across loud and clear. And many of you saw the Google Take Action efforts. Many of you saw a lot of messaging that came in that really has forced, I think, the ITU to think about the context under which key decisions are being made. So those to me are the 4 things, and I'd like to cover these in more detail. First of all, let me talk about the treaty itself. 89 nations signed on. As you know, 55 nations, including ourselves, have not signed and have said explicitly they won't sign, or they're waiting to make decisions. So a variety of nations have gone back to their capitals to say, you know what, we're uncomfortable and we want to get some counsel here. So if we ended up with 30 to 40 nations explicitly saying we're not going to sign, that to me is a very strong statement. And as you know, those nations that agreed with us not to sign included a good part of Europe, including the UK. It included Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the Philippines. It also included Kenya. It also included Costa Rica and Chile and Colombia. So a broad array of countries. Candidly, a lot of them are developed markets, but some notable developing markets that have got some very interesting things happening. So that, first of all, was the context. In terms of the telecom treaty itself, what things came out that were positive? Well, the process actually worked fairly well for all of our opposition to issues. The treaty started to eliminate a lot of fundamental problematic areas, especially on the telecom side. So there are provisions, for example, on mobile roaming, on transparency and the need for mobile roaming transparency that we think was a very good outcome. A second thing is the ETNO proposals. These were proposals on sending party pays, where developers of content and applications potentially would have to pay to have their traffic delivered. That was eliminated. Very important economic piece to have advanced. So there's several areas in the core treaty. Acknowledgement of commercial agreements was a positive one. That, to me, was good news. The second piece is that there was a lot of discussion about the treaty needing to be high level in nature. As you know, when we started out, we said these ITRs should be high level, they shouldn't be prescriptive. And I think when you look at the overall treaty, again on telecom, you'll see it's a fairly high level element. Now, where were the problem areas? And you know, a piece of narrative here is this conference was specifically supposed to be focused on telecommunications. That was the charter of the ITU, that was the charter of this conference. There was a proposal that came out about three weeks before the beginning of the conference from Russia. That was a fairly shocking proposal that had to do a lot with internet governance. It wasn't clear where that was going to go. It wasn't clear where that proposal was going to go. But what ended up happening is that Russian proposal turned into a very similar proposal that was matched with China and a variety of Arab states. So instead of, again, one country putting forward a proposal, it was won by a variety of countries. We made it very clear at this conference, the internet discussion is off the table in our view. And this is a message that you can't equivocate on. Once you open the scope to other areas, you've opened the door. And all the proposals you see can be innocuous in nature and sound harmless, etc. But the minute you open things up to content-related issues, you've changed the nature of the game. So we went through a process of this conference to say these things are off the table. Now, I can say candidly, I was disappointed these issues weren't firmly taken off the table. And I think it's an issue that Hamid and Torre, who overall has been a very good leader, is going to have to reconcile with the charter of the ITU. I think more broadly, a lot of the people that are playing in this set of discussions is going to have to think about where this takes things. Because again, the internet to us is a very different environment. So I think the best outcome that could have happened here is we would have had a pure telecom treaty and acknowledged all the opportunities in telecom. Broadband deployment in the developing markets is a huge opportunity. We could have gone down that path. That was not fully embraced by every nation. And I think that created a very different environment that, again, created the split. If you were to say, listen, was there consensus in this environment? I hardly call 89 nations out of 193 broad consensus. So again, another significant implication here. Let me go through some specific elements of concern, and then I won't end on doom and gloom. The world's not coming to an end. There's a lot of opportunities here. First of all, the issue of recognized operating agencies was one of the stumbling block issues. As many of you know, we put forward a proposal before the conference started and said, listen, we're going to move through this conference well if there can be clarity about what organizations are subject to regulation. And our view is public providers of telecommunication services are the ones that we should be talking about here. These are pure telecom providers. But private network operators, people that are involved in internet-related plays, cloud computing, or government networks, they shouldn't be part of the scope here. That issue became a stumbling block, candidly. A lot of discussion. It ended up advancing in terms of trying to be clear about the implications of the internet, but that was a fundamental issue we could not get comfortable with. Second issue was spam. Spam putting out, again, it sounds great. Everybody's dealing with a significant spam issue. There's no question on the problem. The question is, what is the solution and who owns the solution? So no matter how much wording we looked at on the spam-related issue, it was problematic because it got into a content-related issue. Unsolicited emails. Who decides what is unsolicited? Who decides what in that content is not appropriate? And our view fundamentally is governments should not be in that business of making that decision. It's very, very easy for somebody to make a decision saying, we don't like the political nature of that comment, we're going to call it spam and we're going to block it. So again, despite a lot of efforts with a lot of nations trying to come up with an agreement, that was not one that we could reach agreement on. A third area was network security. Network security, again, relates to a very common issue that many nations face. Issues of hacking and malware, etc. Again, no question there's a big problem. This problem needs to get addressed. But the roles of governments there, again, to look at what is causing those problems, making judgments about that content, we think in this environment it's not an appropriate one. We think much more multi-stakeholder organizations that are open, that are inclusive, that include industry, that include civil society, that these organizations are the right ones to be looking at the issue. So again, that ended up being problematic. And then the final one was internet governance, probably the most fundamental one. And again, a lot of discussions went on internet governance. And on the plus side, the provisions it had to do with internet governance were watered down a lot. There were initially proposals on internet naming conventions. The most fundamental kind of architectural issues was in one of the resolutions that got eliminated. The other elements of governance that talk about the role the ITU has and others ended up being in the broad ITRs, but was moved into a resolution. The resolutions, as you may know, are non-binding elements. So from that standpoint, you'd say it's good. But again, from our point of view, you got to be a purist somewhat on this. This is an issue of the internet coming into a discussion in these ITRs. So we had a lot of reservation, even it showing up in the form of a resolution. So those were the range of things that, again, were concerning to us. Let's talk about now kind of going forward, what are the implications, et cetera. So it's very, very clear the world is in the middle of a discussion now about the internet. And I think a lot of it, maybe because of the role I took, but I sense just at a macro level, this discussion is coming to a head about what the internet does. And I think we need to remind ourselves, what is the goal we're trying to achieve here? The internet fundamentally creates opportunities for citizens to communicate with one another, to share their views, et cetera. It creates opportunities for consumers. Consumers can transact. Entrepreneurs and small businesses can create new services via the internet. And it creates benefits for society because of that economic growth that results, because of the communication and interaction that people have. Actions that we take that impede that development, that opportunity, are going to be problematic. And we've got to keep acknowledging that the internet is very different than telecom. I've come from the telecom side. It's a very different space. The internet does well when, candidly, it's fully left alone. Because you have people that are creating unique content. There's a rate of change in infrastructure, in technology. The users are very different place to place to place. And you have to leave it alone to have that success occur. And so our messaging needs to continue to be what that benefit looks like. Because some countries, candidly, are still wrestling with it. They still look at a balance sheet and they say, well, I see a lot of risks with it, and I see some upside. But the equation is a bit fouled up, to be honest with you. One of my observations, again, coming from the mobile communications industry, as technology moves from country to country to country, it gets better and better and looks different in each place. So in my environment, if you look at a market like Kenya in mobile communications, they've got a service there called M-Pesa. This is a mobile banking application for what is a very large unbanked population. That application didn't exist anywhere else in the world. And you say, well, geez, the US owns the internet and it owns innovation, it owns this and that. It doesn't. It certainly is a hotbed of a lot of great minds and innovation, but the beauty of the technology is it takes its own form as it advances. The other benefit is infrastructure costs go down, device costs go down. You have the beauty of that happening. And I think we need to be spokespeople for the benefit of this technology as it advances country to country. This is not a pure argument of the US is exporting and controlling a technology as it moves abroad. And I think, again, you see markets like Kenya that say, you know what, we agree with the United States and a lot of other countries. Let's leave the internet alone. Let's make sure we've got the right opportunity. It's a fundamental one. The other issue, I think, going forward is on multi-stakeholder governance. This model has got to continue to advance. I think of a Tanzanian communications minister I met with who said, listen, we're a relatively small country. We've got cybersecurity issues. We need help figuring out these issues. We need a sense of what are the best practices. We need to have a sense of what organizations do we work with. We need to feel included In the absence of that working, you have people who say, you know what, I need to go to the ITU, and the ITU is going to be my solution. It's an understandable environment. And the ITU can play very important roles, but not in this area of governance, not in the area of content. And so we have a job to do here to make sure we're advancing a multi-stakeholder governance model that is full of people that are subject matter experts, that can move in an agile way, that can be inclusive, and can answer the Tanzanian communication minister's question. Who do I go to, and where does that help need to happen for me to see success? The other thing I'd say is this whole issue about broadband in developing markets. I think one of the great tragedies of this conference is there wasn't a more full-fledged discussion about how do you advance broadband in Africa and a variety of nations. What a great opportunity to create a connectedness of people in what is a tough environment. And we've already received, quote unquote, a warning that people are talking about economic models to fund it, which we obviously do not think are the right ways to operate. We very much believe open markets with competitors, with a sense of variety of services, lower prices, creates the best opportunity. That issue about broadband availability has got to be a top of the mind agenda item. How do we see that to the advantage of all? This argument to me is very much a global argument. And let me just conclude on that point, because a variety of people have a variety of positions on the conference and where it comes out, et cetera. It's absolutely clear these proposals that came from Russia, from China, from the Arab states are shocking. But you know what? There's a bigger discussion here about the benefits of the internet that will carry the day, I believe fundamentally. It is a long game that has to be worked. We need to see the commercial benefits, the human benefits, et cetera. Let's not pick the most authoritarian regimes to say those are our first areas we want to see huge success. Let's look at a variety of nations in Africa and say, how does the broadband availability issue get solved here in the best way? And so I fundamentally believe that we're in the beginning part of a very important dialogue. These sectors are global sectors. These are not national, local sectors. Telecom, internet are global. We need to be talking in global terms. We need to be engaging with other countries. Many countries we may not agree with, but we need to understand the issues, because when the internet does well, it lifts the water. Everybody does better, but we need to stay in that game of having that continued dialogue. Final point I'll just make is the U.S. is a leader. I came away from this conference feeling very proud of the U.S. Proud from a subject matter expertise standpoint, proud from an engagement standpoint. We had a delegation of 120 people that were fully engaged with a variety of nations, listening, understanding, seeing. You know what? You have countries that aren't going to agree with us, but they still view us as leaders. They want to understand the point of view. We need to not cede that opportunity to somebody else and say we're going to go in our corner and have our own discussion without everybody. We need to continue to take that leadership role. This is a long game effort, and I do believe we'll be as successful with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we will hear from Sally Wentworth, Senior Manager of Public Policy for the Internet Society.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Internet Society, I want to thank you for coming out for this event and for supporting the local chapter of the Internet Society, the DC chapter. It's a very active chapter, one we're quite proud of, and I think they've hosted an excellent event. So congratulations to them, and thanks to all of you for coming out to support it. I have some very similar points, I think, to make as the ambassador, but also coming at this from the perspective of a global organization, a nonprofit, not a member state, yet participating somehow, awkwardly at times, in an international treaty process. And thinking through where we've come over the last, we started working specifically on the ITRs in about 18 months ago as the Internet Society, and it's been a long journey. And I'll talk a little bit about what we've done and what our objectives were, what our impressions were of the conference, and then a little bit of looking forward for ISOC and trying to take the messages and the lessons learned from this conference. When we looked at the ITRs about 18 months ago, it wasn't the first time that we had thought of the ITRs, but as the preparatory process stood up and became more formalized at the ITU, it became apparent that we needed to be engaged not just as a sort of the headquarters of the Internet Society, but from the perspective of our global members, whether they be at the chapter level, the individual level, or the organizational level. And I will say that the response from the Internet Society community worldwide has been tremendous. And I think from my perspective, and for those watching on the webcast and whatnot, we really thank the community for stepping up, for helping us work through these issues, and allowing the Internet Society to be a voice that was hopefully helpful and constructive to the process for governments like the United States and others around the world. When we approached this about 18 months ago, we noted particularly that there were some fundamental principles of the Internet that were at stake in this conference. This was an intergovernmental process that had the serious potential to impact the Internet, both at an architectural level, at a commercial level, from a content perspective, operationally, et cetera. Those fears, those concerns, I think, were heightened over the course of the 18 months or so. I mean, this is a process that's been going on for a decade, but as the serious proposals came forward, it became apparent that those concerns were well-founded. And we saw increasingly proposals related to security, related to content and spam, related to regulation of traffic routing, interconnection policies, numbering, standards, and some proposals that struck us as moving towards something akin to national internets. So we were concerned fundamentally because this was happening in an intergovernmental process where at the core governments make these decisions, and also because we believe that the internet is a force for good. It's a force for communications, it's a force for innovation, but not if these fundamental aspects of the internet become subject to an international treaty. We also came to this, again, given that this was an intergovernmental process, that we wanted our community to be aware. The beauty of the internet, and I think the impact of the internet on public policy, not just related to internet public policy, but related to public policy in general, should not be underestimated by public policymakers. This is a clear demonstration that informed communities, informed users, informed stakeholders can have an impact. And that wasn't just in the US. We had Internet Society, and not just Internet Society, communities, interested communities from different parts of the internet community around the world holding events, reaching out to their governments, expecting to be heard. Governments that for ITU processes had never really held multi-stakeholder or open discussions started to have those going into the treaty process, all of which we thought was extremely healthy and extremely important to help governments make informed and hopefully sustainable decisions. So, you know, we had events in the Philippines, there were events in Kenya, there was a major event in Germany, and these happened all over the world as internet users became aware, became informed, and reached out to their policymakers, both in the expectation that they would be heard, but also with the offer of assistance. Do you want to understand what these proposals mean? We operate a particular aspect of the architecture. We have expertise here that we can bring to bear. And I think that was all an extremely encouraging aspect of this process and something we were really happy to be a part of. The other part of our approach was that we really did want to be a resource for governments. To the extent that this was a policy discussion where governments wanted information, were asking questions. If they were asking questions about routing, We, as the Internet Society and with our partners in the Internet community, wanted to help provide answers if we could. And I think that we hope was useful, but unfortunately, in the end, this is an intergovernmental process. We were not, obviously, did not have a seat at the table. And so it was awkward, I guess, to be honest, at the end when discussions were being held among governments, sometimes in open session, sometimes not, about a technology, about a resource that we care deeply about. So we participated in the process to the extent that we could. We tried to be a resource for governments where we could, while also stating very clearly that we did not believe that the Internet and all of its complexities, all of its diversity, was well suited for a static treaty. And that was a fundamental position of the Internet Society. When we went into the details of the treaty, another key position of the Internet Society was that there should not be expansion of scope of the treaty. This was a treaty that was written in 1988 to regulate international telecommunications as understood in 1988. We did not believe that that scope should be expanded to include providers of the Internet, the content of the Internet, or the operations of the Internet. And we also were hopeful that the conference would focus on what works. If we look back since 1988, I think we have a very clear track record, much of which, honestly, the ITU has even recognized in a lot of its work, particularly in the ITU development sector. The work to build competitive markets, to drive down costs for end users, the work to liberalize government-owned operators, to liberalize markets, to open up and create greater transparency in the regulatory structure, to provide for independent regulation. These were all things that have clearly worked in the field of international telecommunications since 1988. And we had hoped that in updating the treaty and keeping it to a very high level, that those were the things that countries would focus on, because those are things that have clearly worked and have been recognized over and over again. To some extent, I think that happened. There was some discussion about those principles, but I'll be honest, from our perspective, the discussion on things like competition, on liberalization, on independent regulation was far too short as compared to discussions about regulating routing, enhanced language on security, content-related issues, and then ultimately when we were faced towards the end with this Internet resolution that frankly had not been the source of any discussion on the floor. I think what that pointed to ultimately was the limitations, which we had all recognized, of an intergovernmental process to try to encapsulate these very complex issues. So the Internet Society's view ultimately of the conference is one of disappointment. I think, as the ambassador said, even perhaps one of missed opportunities for the ITU, for the member states, for the community at large. Having said that, there were a number of things, and I won't repeat the ambassador's comments, but there were a number of areas where progress was made and where some of the worst of what we had been facing, even as late as a week ago today, I think, did not materialize in the final acts. And that is something that I think is very good. Looking forward, which is, I think, the key objective now is, there's a bit of uncertainty, frankly, I would assume, among the operator community, among others in the Internet community, about the extent to which this lack of consensus and will impact the community, will impact the Internet, will impact the operators. That is an open question in our mind as we move to implementation. Those 89 governments, I think companies will be looking very carefully about what that means going forward. On a positive side, I think for the Internet Society, despite the fact that we did not believe that an intergovernmental treaty process was the right forum, this was an opportunity to hear the very real concerns of governments around the world. And as the ambassador said, there may be some for whom changing minds is a very, very long-term process, But there are a host of governments who want more internet deployment, they want more connectivity, they want more services, they want to be part of the innovative cycle that the internet provides, they want to be part of the global internet community. And to the extent that they have concerns that they raised, it's incumbent upon the internet community to listen to those, to hear those, to reflect on those, and to see where we have a role to play in helping to address those concerns. Having said that, the Internet Society is never going to believe that an intergovernmental process is the way to address those concerns. But we do have, obviously, very strong relationships with the Internet Engineering Task Force, with other standards bodies. I know the IEEE is here, I see. The internet community has a very broad reach and has a commitment to listening and to reflecting on what we've heard, and that is our responsibility coming out of this. So some disappointment, some lessons learned, and also I think a really profound recognition of the scope and the reach of the internet community and their ability to speak up and to be heard. And from that perspective, that's extremely encouraging.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now we'll hear from Harold Feld, a Senior Vice President with Public Knowledge.
Thank you. First, I need to make a disclaimer, which is I was a participant as an advisory member of the United States delegation to the WCIT. My comments here are entirely my own. They do not reflect any official position of the United States or the U.S. delegation. For that, you have the gentleman to my right. But this is why I wish to talk a little bit more at length on what both Ambassador Kramer and Sally Wentworth have discussed, which is the role of civil society, which in the WCIT and in the lead up to the WCIT, both for what it meant and how it plays out in the post-conference and what it means going forward. First of all, the very fact that I have to make such a disclaimer is itself a testament to both the importance of civil society in the debate and the leadership of the United States in reaching out to our civil society component domestically and also internationally. The United States was present at one of the key organizing events for civil society prior to the WCIT, the Best Bits meeting in Baku, Azerbaijan, and which was a critical event to try to organize global civil society around this. And the fact that the United States came, made presentations to an international group of civil society organizations involved in not merely free expression issues, but digital divide and digital development issues, and a number of other issues, I think was very important in establishing the credibility of the United States when it raised freedom of expression concerns. It's very easy, and certainly a number of delegates, came with a suspicion with regard to the motivation of the United States and other developed countries in raising these freedom of expression concerns, and the fact that the United States did not merely raise them when convenient, but genuinely engaged with civil society and included civil society representation on delegation, I think was very important in establishing our credibility. And the same can be said of many other nations, not just in the developed world, but also in the developing world, which included civil society in their national delegations. That said, I also want to add with regard to the ITU, I think there has been an unfortunate tendency to demonize the ITU as an institution and to portray Secretary General Torre as sort of the villain of the peace, trying to extend the ITU control over the internet In fact, there were a lot of petitions that said exactly this. I think that's very unfortunate. Now, I will say that there were times in dealing with the ITU and the ITU staff that they struck me as having the same charming cluelessness that the FCC does on occasion when it deals with public and civic engagement. But that said, like the FCC, I sense that there's a genuine desire on the part of the ITU to try to get it right. There was the webcasting, which was extremely important in creating, in the ability of people to participate remotely and follow what was going on, was an innovation for the ITU that was resisted by some of the members, but Secretary General Torre did feel that it was important. This was a case where I think Secretary General Torre recognized that good politics coincided with the right thing to do, that it was necessary for the ITU to maintain legitimacy, to open its processes and be seen to be engaging with civil society. I think other delegations likewise recognize this, which is an important breakthrough. We would not have had the debate around the human rights language, which we had at WCIT, if a number of member states did not feel, much as some of them may have resented it, did not feel pressure from their populations to show that the ITU and the ITRs were not designed, at least from their perspective, to infringe on fundamental human rights. All of that said, one of the biggest problems in this is that some of them did, or potentially did, in the sense of going to core freedom of expression concerns that were raised in advance. I think that Ambassador Kramer has rightly pointed out that there were some very alarming proposals that were put out there, and that some of the delegates were, when the cameras were off, quite explicit about their concern that the information that they wanted to track down people who were saying things that they did not like, whether that was blasphemous or scandalous or spam or what we would regard as political dissent, was, as one delegate put it in working group, locked up by operators outside of their sovereign borders, and the only way they felt that they could effectively track what they thought of as bad content back to its source was to have an international regulation that would allow them to go to other governments and say, this treaty overrides your privacy laws and your other domestic policies, and you have to require your network operators to give us the information we want. From my standpoint as a organization that is very deeply concerned with global free expression, and for a number of other organizations were involved, this is a very scary conversation. In defense of many of these delegates, I point out one can find equally scary conversations like this in the halls of the Senate and the House of Representatives, where people, for the best of reasons, want to put in place rules that would have, from our perspective, horrendous consequences for free expression. The virtue of our Congress is having an open and democratic process. It is possible for citizens and civil society to engage and hold these representatives directly accountable and educate them and head off bad policy. That is harder in the ITU context. But I do think that civil society played a very important role in addressing these proposals. I think that there was an accountability for the ITU delegates and for the ITU as an institution that had not previously been there because its work had not been in the public eye. There is something that David Post refers to as the reverse Tinkerbell effect, which is the more people believe something awful is going to happen, the less it becomes true because there is pressure to prevent it from happening. So I believe that there was a substantial reverse Tinkerbell effect here for a number of these delegations. I think that it was also very important to recognize that fundamental human rights of free expression are a part of the global internet. Whether that translates to a fundamental right of access, and I can debate Vint Cerf on this some other time, or whether that simply means that when we are formulating policies even technical policies that address what happens online and the technical capacities of the networks, that those can have implications for human rights and free expression, I think is a very important recognition. I also think that it created a lot of independent sources of information, not just from ISOC, but from a number of other organizations, including organizations from the developing world. There are countries that are naturally suspicious when developed countries or industry sources from developed countries come and tell them what you're doing is actually going to hurt your ability to deploy networks rather than help your ability to deploy networks. It's a different situation when Afrinic and other organizations that are native to the countries and to the regions say, no, there really is a technical issue. And having the right messenger for a lot of these messages is a critically important component, and I think was very important in helping to inform a number of delegations about the unintended consequences of some of the proposals that were floated. Finally, there is an ongoing role with regard even to the WCIT in post-treaty discussions. Many of these countries that have not signed are currently discussing in their capitals whether to sign or not. The civil society organizations and members of the public in those countries hopefully are and will remain engaged in those discussions with their own governments about the implications of signing the treaty and its interpretation, which will continue to be ongoing. I mean, it's important to realize this doesn't end. Countries can sign at any time. They can also express reservations of their own interpretations. And so even though the WCIT is over, there continues to be an important element of post-WCIT, both interpretation of what happened and discussion within these countries about what signing or not signing would mean. Looking forward, I have to say first, we need to work more closely with the ITU from a civil society perspective. Sorry, was I too close there? From a civil society perspective on institutional change. The ITU, I think, was very supportive and made very good strides in increasing transparency, increasing public engagement, and they are to be applauded for this. We had some problems at the WCIT that we raised to the Secretary General with regard to things like submission to public comments and how those would work. But civil society in public engagement generally is not the same as engagement by nation states or even engagement by sector members. The role that is played by civil society is very different, and we need to work with the ITU to better accommodate the nature of that role and the limitations of civil society organizations. Finally, we need to continue to maintain global civil society engagement with the ITU generally and on these issues that were raised in the WCIT, both what is appropriate for the ITU and the digital deployment issues that have also been discussed. Even here in the United States, we've recognized that market liberalization is one critical component. It is not the only element in ensuring universal access. We wouldn't have a universal service fund, and we wouldn't have the debates on digital divide that we've had in the United States over the last 15 years if all that were required were market liberalization. And I think that, in fact, the United States is in a position to play a very strong leadership role, not just in trying to find financial support in these countries and not just in pressing for liberalization, but also in showing how we have dealt with the problem of universal service and universal access through a host of non-obvious approaches, such as liberalization of unlicensed spectrum for some uses, for rural broadband, our universal service fund, which is a national approach to high-cost areas, E-rate and other proposals that have moved this forward in the private sector, all of which are things that many developing nations need to look at carefully for what is suitable for them and not assume that this is a problem that is identical to the deployment of traditional telecommunications networks, where there was an established model for penetration that many of these countries still see as the primary model by which they will bring widely dispersed, high-quality broadband. So I think there is a lot of work ahead, a lot of engagement, both in the ITU and without, for civil society. And the last thing I will mention is the ITU will have its plenipotentiary in 2014 in Busan, South Korea. That is an opportunity where many of these issues will be raised again without some of the limitations that cabined the ITR debate. At WCIT, there was an argument to be made that, well, if something conflicts with the ITU Constitution, if something does not, that it can't go into the ITRs, that there are limits to the ITU Charter, those are things that could be potentially addressed in a plenipotentiary conference in 2014. So from our perspective, I think we really have about 2 years to work on those countries who have viewed traditional ITU jurisdiction and a traditional ITU approach as being the best approach to address their concerns, and really work to persuade them that there are other more suitable approaches that they should very carefully consider.
Thank you very much, Harold Feld. And now we have some time for questions and comments. I think what we will do is take the mic from up here and bring it out into the audience so that everyone can hear it both in the room as well as on the internet. If anyone wants to post any questions to the hashtag WCIT or ISOC-DC, we'd be happy to entertain that also.
I'm Julie Saunier from the FCC. I'm charmingly clueless, thank you very much.
You guys all love me, I know.
I know, we do. We love our civil society. I don't want to take you off track, and I know this wasn't your conference, but it's gotten a lot of play, and some of the play in the press has been sort of distorted, so I'd just like some perspective on it. And that's the adoption at the WITSA conference immediately prior to WCIT of the ITR standard on deep packet inspection. And how should we look at that? Should we be threatened, as a lot of people, is it the end of the world as we know it, or what exactly is it? I'd appreciate that.
Well, I guess that's for me. I don't want to speak for that recommendation, just for the record. Our understanding of what happened, this is a recommendation, it's a study question that originated in the 2008 ITUT study program for, I believe it was Study Group 13. It was a question, the work began, it was quickly moved into what's called the traditional approval process, because at least one government had concerns about the policy implications of the recommendation. There are actually, it might be interesting for folks to know, there's the recommendation. There is also, moving through Study Group 13, which has not yet been approved, something called a framework for implementation. Folks are interested in this, I'd highly recommend taking a look at that. That seems to be something that's still open for discussion within the ITU. In any case, the recommendation was worked on over that 4-year period. It was delayed a number of times because of these policy concerns. A traditional approval process at the ITU takes quite a bit more time. Those concerns were raised at the Study Group 13 meeting in the summer, and the decision was made that it needed to go to the WTSA for consideration. The WTSA adopted a chapeau piece, which goes atop the standard, which says something to the effect that this has to be implemented subject to national law and national regulation, which is of course true of all ITU recommendations. So this is another recommendation, but it did generate enough concern that it was passed with that chapeau language, based on the concerns, again, as I understand it, of at least one member state. Others are looking, I think, at the technical implications of that recommendation. There were concerns expressed early on by the Internet Architecture Board via a liaison with the IETF. There was a liaison many, many years ago, and nothing was ever followed up from the ITU. So that's what we understand where things are. There is a recommendation on this issue. There is also an open topic at the ITU in Study Group 13. This is not finished, and by that I mean there is this other document called the framework. And I think, again, if the community is very interested in this, very concerned, this is probably something to investigate more carefully.
I do think that this points out the need for those of us who are engaging with the ITU to understand that it is a very complex institution, that it didn't just come into being for the wicket. Right. It has actual ongoing work. It's done things since it developed the International Numbering Plan, that many of its components are in fact very useful things that we rely on, like the WRC, the World Radio Conference, which plays a critical role in frequency coordination internationally, that there are many countries that rely on the ITU recommendations, and that when I occasionally hear from the American technical engineering community about how ITU and their standards are obsolete and we should just ignore them, I do caution that no, those standards are actually very important, very valuable in a good deal of the world, and it's important for us to engage, not to walk off and think that, you know, we've got it right and we've got everything settled here. At the same time, it also highlights something that was a lesser publicized matter of contention in the discussions, which was whether recommendations of the ITU-T should be considered mandatory as part of the ITU, as part of the ITRs. And it is one thing to say this is a very valuable institution that does international standards work that is very helpful for a number of countries, both for their internal development and for international cooperation. It is another thing to say that every country must be bound by this and enable these technical recommendations when they occur. So I guess the upshot is it wasn't the end of the world. It was not, I think, part of the overall sinister plan of the ITU to have the wiretapping specs in place before they assumed control of internet governance. But at the same time, it does highlight how even these technical, highly technical recommendations have significant impact, and how what are apparently minor word issues in an international treaty can have enormous consequences.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is David McCauley with Bloomberg BNA, and I have a question with two facets aimed, I guess, primarily at Ambassador Kramer, but also others, and that is on the going forward discussion. I'm trying to determine what's the basis for going forward. 104 nations that signed the ITRs in 1988 have not signed the new ITRs. So what are the ITRs now as we go forward? And then secondly, if I'm not mistaken, there was a discussion at WCIT about WCIT itself recurring every 8 years. And it hasn't happened in 25 years, or at least that treaty hasn't been revised in 25 years. Assuming that there is an every 8-year WCIT discussion, and if the U.S. participates, is that some kind of an implicit recognition that this new document is the basis for discussion in the next event, and therefore some kind of implicit recognition of Resolution 3?
Good, David. Thanks for the question. Let me take the first one. The countries, first of all, that do not sign, the 55. Let's see where the final number ends up. basically revert to the original ITRs. So the 1988 ITRs are the ones the US and most of Europe, et cetera, Asia are all subject to. The countries that have signed up, the 89, the new ITRs don't go into effect till January of 2015. As you know, there's not an enforcement mechanism with those ITRs. So I think there's a broader issue here about how practical and how much impact actually these ITRs have. I think there's a real question mark there. I think the broader issue is the one that you're implying here is what is the discussion going forward? Because there's been a polarization of views here that's been manifest in this. There is a sense, I think, with everybody, now varying degrees of who wants to act on it, but there's a sense that these are global sectors that are going to be harmed by having this polarization. Now, some authoritarian nations may say, fine, I'm willing to deal with that polarization because I feel so strongly about these other issues. But I like to think that there's a vast array of countries that are concerned with this lack of consensus. And I think, again, it's going to be the charter of the ITU that's going to have to look at this in more detail. While all this is going on, this issue of advocacy and engagement with a variety of other nations needs to be full throttle. We need to be really having a much broader discussion, again, about broadband issues, about multi-stakeholder governance issues, where do countries go to get assistance on cybersecurity. All of that needs to be a much more active debate. And I'd like to think that with that debate, number one, number two, with the technology rolling through markets, it creates its own positive benefit. And number three, with the ITU dealing with its own future. You know, Hamid Touri appropriately is concerned about what does the ITU look like in the future. And I think that is an important message about his thinking. And, you know, I think if he's a forward-looking leader, he'll realize that the telecom charter is the right area, and these other areas are going to get him nowhere in terms of broader support. So I think that's where the discussion needs to be. We're not in the camp of having an every 8-year discussion. You know, these sectors have done incredibly well in the 24 years since the ITRs were last updated, and we're going to continue to advocate on that.
I do think, though, that your question underscores a point that Harold made a few minutes ago, which is the 2014 Plenipotentiary Conference, which happens several months just prior to when the ITRs come into force, is an extremely important event. And between now and then, as the ambassador said, it's a matter of how do we as a community engage to try to answer and address some of these questions. It's also a time to watch the ITU and to figure out how the ITU is absorbing the lessons learned here. There are a number of directions they could go. Some of them would be positive. Some of them could be, you know, a hardening of position, a hardening of what we saw over the last 4 weeks, 2 weeks. But I'm just reading the resolution, and it says that the 2014 Plenipotentiary Conference should consider the resolution and take necessary action to convene periodically, for example, every 8 years, a world conference on ITRs, taking into account financial implications. So this is very much an open question and will factor into this broader question at the Plenipotentiary Conference as to the scope of the union and the scope of their activities.
There's one other point that I think is important, and hopefully the ITU recognizes this institutionally, which is one of the great secrets for the ITU's success, which has now been nearly 150 years, has been that it is insanely, mind-numbingly boring. It performs at when it works well, it facilitates a focus on really important technical and economic details that grease the wheels of international telecommunications and the commerce element of international telecommunications. That is to say, having an international telephone system really helps. Having some international guides for coordinating frequencies so that you can have global standards for the manufacture of mobile equipment really helps. If you make the ITU interesting by bringing in content issues, cybersecurity issues, censorship issues, if it becomes a place where nation states believe that it is not a place just to coordinate with other countries, but a place to compel recalcitrant nations to help them in whatever they think their appropriate goal is, that will destroy the consensus-based approach of the ITU. I think there were a lot of people who were very shocked by the fact that this came to a vote. I believe that Secretary General Torre was sincere when he said repeatedly that we are not an institution that does this by voting, we're an institution that does things by consensus. I think that consensus is difficult to impossible when the issues are too interesting. And hopefully, as the ITU and those who are invested in the continuing success of the ITU will come to understand that there is a choice between making this an institution that is going to try to revisit, hot issues every couple of years and keeping this a very boring, technical, but very effective organization for what it does.
I want to interject a quick question that I'm drawing from the broader internet community. So 55 member states did not sign onto the ITRs, including the United States, and I guess this is a question to the ambassador. What was the main sticking point for not signing on, and what could have been different for the United States to sign on?
So there were two issues really that I would say that became the sticking point. One is a philosophical issue about inclusion of any internet-related issues. That, at the very beginning of the conference, was the point of view, and at the end of the conference, that was the issue, and it kept kind of moving into it. Now, what will all the other nations say to that? I think you'll get a variety of other nations that will also add the issue about the human rights amendment that was put forward. The human rights proposal was absolutely the right one in terms of looking out for individual human rights. But that effort, like the conference itself, was hijacked by several nations, including Iran and Cuba and some African nations, that sought to put a government element onto human rights, basically polluting the idea of human rights. Some of these countries we have sanctions against, as you know. So I think there were several other nations, including Europe, that said the internet issues are problematic, but we finally got tipped over when we saw the human rights piece. So I think those two things together were really the main ones.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to just add on the human rights piece in particular to what Ambassador Kramer said, because it goes deeply to a lot of the concerns of civil society. There is a separate question that one can pose as to whether it is appropriate for nation states to block access to telecommunications, either for regions of national interest or in response to human rights violations within those nations. That's an interesting debate to have. But to hijack the language of personal human rights for what were clearly national goals which were rejected within other working groups within the conference. This was language that was proposed to be included in the ITRs directly. It was rejected as part of the consensus. To have it tacked on as part of what should have been a crowning moment for fundamental human rights and the acknowledgement that even the most technical international agreements can have implications for freedom of expression was, from my perspective, and just speaking as a First Amendment advocate here in the United States, uniquely offensive.
Elliot Maxwell. Ambassador, you did a very good job of summarizing the position of the U.S. government and why it made the decisions it did. Maybe you could just put on Secretary General Torre's hat for a moment and say, what would he be telling the world about the triumph of the conference if he had the same opportunity that you have today? How would he pose the success of this organization and institution?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. Let me share here the view I think others might say as critics of the United States and others. What they would say, the argument would go like this. We looked at the Russia-China Arab state proposal that had a lot of internet governance in it. We looked at the US proposal that was pure telecom oriented, and we looked at where could we find a common ground against all of that. They'd say 80% of all the internet, the offensive internet related issues in the Russian-China Arab proposal were eliminated. And so the Americans were not negotiating in good faith, would be the argument they would make. And so the question is, what do you say about that last 20%? Because either you believe fundamentally the internet does not belong in the discussion, or you don't, and you don't equivocate on the issue. So I think what the argument would go is the US should have been more flexible along with a variety of other nations. I think it's completely disingenuous to say the US already had an agenda and it wanted the conference not to go well. I've seen spurious comments about that, and I think it's kind of a grandstanding effort, because I think that's not true. We spent a lot of time trying to carve out success. And I'm going to add to your question a bit for my own purposes here, because I think it's related to a broader thing. If you're the Secretary General of the ITU, what do you do in this situation? What I would have said should have been done is say, listen, we've got very divergent views here. You're concerned about the future of the ITU and where it goes. Let's find the areas we can agree on, and let's make that the focus of this conference. We could have gone much, much deeper and broader on broadband. On telecom, where telecom is going from an infrastructure standpoint, access in a variety of developing markets, that could have been a fundamental discussion that would have been in the news, would have been discussed in a variety of angles, would have gotten commitment from nations to advance that, and that was a huge, huge missed opportunity. But it was a conscious choice they made not to get into that. And in exchange, as Harold mentioned, these what they think are sexy issues have polluted the conference, and I think from a leadership standpoint was not a good move. I would not do it if I were in that case. Now, it's a delicate move, because what you need to do is not invalidate all the nations that want to have the internet discussion. But what I would have done is said there are better fora to have that discussion. Let's find a better fora. We'll agree on what those issues are. We'll agree on the construct for that, and we're going to get that off the table, because it's more important that we stay together. It's important for Hamid and Torre to say, what is the future of the ITU and how do I protect that? It's important for the world in what is a global environment to stay aligned. And that's where I thought there was a huge missed opportunity. And when I made my statement on Thursday night, it was a very conscious choice to use the term missed opportunity, because this wasn't just an issue where we couldn't reconcile. It's a much more fundamental one. There was an opportunity there that was missed. And I think now going forward, we need to see a way that the ITU takes that on or not. Because if they can't take that on, it's going to be a problematic environment for them, and it's going to be a missed opportunity globally. Sally, can you hand me the coffee in front of the computer thing?
Alden Abbott. I'm a former government official now in the private sector, but just speaking on my own. Ambassador Kramer commendably stressed the importance of competition, particularly broadband rollout. I'll just call the attention to the fact there's something called the International Competition Network, which is a virtual network of most of the world's competition agencies, founded 11 years ago. The U.S. Justice Department, Federal Trade Commission participate, as do the agencies of many developed and developing countries, including key ITU participants. And that network moves towards convergence through no binding requirement, but rather by establishing best practices. It also has something called the Competition Advocacy Working Group, currently co-chaired by Mauritius, Portugal, and France, that's working to promote stronger recognition of competition cultures, both within civil society of individual members and also other government agencies. And I know traditionally there have been separate boxes, telecom and competition. However, I think as sort of U.S. government continues to try to promote competition going forward, it's useful to look at other intergovernmental, even virtual mechanisms, such as the ICN, as ways to advance some of these notions. I don't know if the ambassador has any comments on that or not.
Yeah, and let me make a general comment because I think that's exactly the spirit of it. And Harold made some good upgrades. First of all, the fundamental issue here is about, do you believe in competition or not? Because you look at a lot of the nations that didn't agree with us, they have government-owned networks that have high prices and low penetration. So they're not solving the internet issue with that. So then the question is, if you believe in the open markets, what is the best way to do that? How do you provide the protections that Harold raised? And I think you're exactly right. There's a variety of best practices that a lot of these organizations have got that the U.S. should be willing to contribute. And what would those things be? What are the best practices in mobile spectrum awards? Nations across the world are dealing with spectrum awards that create revenue for governments that are needed, but there's a certain construct that works best. How do you work on network sharing? So you get into a lot of developing markets in rural areas. India is a great example, and the operators there say, we cannot build out, we cannot provide mobile service, internet access, etc. It is not economic to do that. So there are models now that say you can have competitors, quote-unquote competitors, work with one another, build out one network, but they're building out, and they provide full coverage broadly. What are the best practices that allow that doesn't violate competition law, et cetera? What are the best practices on independent regulatory agencies, how they can run, how they can operate, et cetera? How do you create public-private partnerships? There's a litany of these things. And again, to go back to my earlier point, that was a huge missed opportunity. That should have been a discussion that would have advanced the thinking and what fora they exist, et cetera, that we should have gotten into, as opposed to talking about, again, the objectionable internet-related issues.
Well, and just to add on to that, and I see Roxanne over there, who's been a strong participant in the ITD for a long time. Some of those concepts that we're talking about are not new to the ITU. These are concepts, for those of us who've worked particularly in the development sector, but not exclusively, that have been part of, if you go back to ITU development declarations for years. And so I think part of the missed opportunity was not taking this conference in that direction from a leadership perspective. And there were opportunities. This was not, while the culmination of this was in a 2-week negotiation, there were months and months and years of preparation where the groundwork for that kind of constructive discussion that would have really moved these countries forward who want more connectivity, want more broadband, could have seen some progress. But that's not, unfortunately, those principles, and even we tried to articulate those in our contribution through the public process, pulling out from the Hyderabad Declaration of the ITU development sector, those core principles. And I think one of the breaking points for us was when that draft resolution that really brought those issues to the fore was, there was a movement to suppress it. And there was consensus in the room to suppress the main resolution that would have brought those principles forward. So that was a huge disappointment, I think, from our perspective.
It was.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say congratulations, first of all. I mean, I think that the successes that you talked about initially are legitimate. I think, it's not spin. And I mean, for those of us that weren't at the conference, I mean, we're just kind of trying to get some insight, and I think they're really legitimate. I think the whole multi-stakeholder, getting people to involve that's just unprecedented. So, and I don't know how you're standing, really, because you had an incredibly difficult job, and I've always found you to be very constructive and positive. So I'm very glad that the U.S. was leading on that in that way. My question is, I know that a lot of attention was towards these really horrible proposals by, the countries that we've all talked about. I feel like I have a sense, though, that there were lots of other countries, in the middle that really wanted to come and get something out of, a global consensus on how to move things forward. And I wanted to know what your sense was of what did they receive out of the, first of all, what did you learn about the things that they are really trying to get at that are not these extreme things, but that are the things that we should be thinking about going forward? And what out of the document, of the final acts, do you believe that we got? And was there anything there in your discussions that I don't want to say was a surprise, but was sort of enlightening, like, okay, now, I feel like we kind of went in with specific positions and we came out with specific positions. And I wonder, did we have any movement, and was there any, was there give and take, and where was that, where would you describe that from the U.S.? And the other question was, what were the deal breakers, but you already answered that, so thank you.
Good. Maybe I'll take a shot, and feel free to add on. So I think you're making a very good point, because we tend to have, I think people have a monolithic view about the nations that voted in favor, and it's an inaccurate portrayal. So first of all, are we going to convince Russia or China to change their views in the short term on these issues? It's not a realistic objective. If you look at our outreach activity, where we focus our effort, it wasn't heavily in that area, because it was very clear that's not going to be a productive use of resource. There are a huge number of countries that we would call swing states, that we would say you can have the discussion there. They're listening, they want to have a dialogue, et cetera. Much of Africa I would put in that case, especially English-speaking Africa. I think the Francophone countries, it's going to be a bit more difficult, but I think a lot of English-speaking Africa is in that case. I think a lot of Latin America. We have a variety of nations. It's in our own region. But a variety of nations want to have a discussion there. So I think there are a variety. India, somewhat, I think would have a discussion with us. So we need to be spending more time with those nations. And I give you a couple of examples where I see the challenge, and where I think some of them, to the question earlier, where would the rub be with the United States? People would say, listen, share with us your view about business models and liberalization, et cetera, but you need to listen to us. Don't preach at us about, your models and how they work. That's a very heartfelt message. And so we need to be doing a lot more engagement to understand the uniqueness of each market. How do you end up with this outcome? Where is a transition point without sacrificing our fundamental views about open markets? So it's a lot of finesse, but it's a very important piece of finesse, because if you miss that finesse, you come across as if you're preaching to the rest of the world, and people will go the other direction. Cybersecurity. We went through a very elaborate effort internally as part of our U.S. delegation to say, where are the resources for cybersecurity? And if you're in Tanzania, as an example, where do you go? Well, for good or for bad, there are 17 agencies on the list that countries can go to. And it's matrixed by geography and technical expertise, et cetera. And we need to have a more clear message there. Where do people go? Because in the absence of it, people will say the ITU needs to enhance their capability. So I found that, and again, this wasn't any lack of effort on our government agencies or industry or civil society. I think industries realize they're going to have to step up more actively in a public way to address these issues. So I think there's a variety of those things that say we've got to keep engaging and keep asking ourselves these critical questions. Is multi-stakeholder governance, how does that work? Again, if you're sitting in Tanzania, how do you perceive it? What works, what doesn't work, et cetera? How do you fill in, et cetera? And I very much believe that this kind of warmongering conversation on the ITU is a very counterproductive exercise. We will isolate ourselves very rapidly in a global area, and we'll feel foolish at the end of it. What should be the discussion is, how do you bolster multi-stakeholder governance? It is a positive message, but it's a pragmatic one. So we don't need to make value judgments, positive, negative, this and that. Just say, listen, the end goal is being pragmatic and advancing it. What do we need to do to keep advancing multi-stakeholder governance? It has made a huge leap for an industry guy, candidly, that wasn't that much engaged with civil society, and I have been hugely, hugely impressed. And the efforts that Harold mentioned in terms of ITU transparency, huge gains. Okay, so now you say, with that improvement, what is the step function improvement past that? That's what I would put forward to the organization here. How do you do that? How do you work with government, et cetera, to make that a reality? That should be our charter, and that will get us success. It will get us success with the swing states, and that's all we need to worry about. We will win if we have the swing states with us. So that to me would be the charter the next couple of years.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to what Ambassador Kramer said and emphasize to some degree that we need to recognize that the United States, or even the United States and Europe, cannot dictate internet policy by fiat. And I think that, unfortunately, one of the problems was prior to engagement over the wicket, I will be quite frank, I think there was a certain amount of arrogance that was expressed, not by this administration necessarily, but I think sort of generally emanating in our policy globally was, we're doing great, we got the answers, you all ought to listen to us. If people remember the debates of the 1990s and the O's, we talked about the American consensus around kind of a very pure vision of market liberalization and just kind of trust us, we've got the answers and it's fine. I have seen in a number of places a reaction to what happened at the wicket to be well, forget these guys. If they don't understand, that we've got the answers, we can just go home and who needs the ITU anyway? This is a very counterproductive position to take. It is a counterproductive position to take by the engineering community, by industry, by folks who want to remain engaged in this area. It is incumbent for us to recognize that it is a very complicated world out there right now. It's not just a world of have and have-nots. There are a lot of nations at very different stages of their deployment and development. We have to recognize that Brazil is in a different place from Chile, is in a different place from Kenya, is in a different place from Mali, is in a different place from keep going around. And every one of these countries is in a very different place, confronting their own set of unique challenges. And we need to be very clear, as part of the message that we are projecting, that we are not saying that everything that works great here should work great abroad. We are saying we have a lot of experience in some of these problems that you're confronting, and there's a lot of value in looking at what worked for us and seeing what works for you guys for that. And I think there's an important message to industry stakeholders to really step up in terms of the amount that they are investing in development in these countries. And I think those are the really very important takeaways that we ought to have coming out of this.
Hi, I'm Gary Arlen from Arlen Communications, and although this may be a very naive question, Harold, your comment just now about industry and your earlier comments about commerce and commercialization, my question is about the arms merchants of this business. The Alcatels, the Ciscos, the Huaweis, and other companies that clearly have a big financial stake in going forward in this. Do they have any role whatsoever? Do you listen to them? Do they come and talk in any way to persuade any of this policy movement which will help them wherever they want to sell, which presumably is anywhere?
One of the things about this conference, again, while it was member states, there was an enormous amount of interest, both from, we've talked about it, civil society, from the technical community, but also from industry. And so the companies you mentioned, but not limited to those companies, who saw themselves, their commercial agreements, their business models, their even just simply their stake in a model that promotes evolution and innovation were very much a part of the discussion, whether it was at the, at their own advocacy levels in countries or on national delegations. Certainly a number of those you mentioned were on the US delegation, but not limited to that. So there was a tremendous amount of interest across the board from different aspects of the community, which is in part why you saw the outcome, I think, that you did. And maybe I'll just take the liberty in touching on some of the points in terms of lessons learned and what we do going forward. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact this was an event. This was certainly an inflection point. There's a lot of good work and a lot of good movement and growth going on in some of these countries that we were talking about, in terms of the building of internet exchange points, the integration of these countries and these policymakers into the internet multi-stakeholder model, We see that at the Internet Society. We're seeing it increasingly at the IETF. We're seeing it in ICANN. We're seeing it at the Internet Governance Forum, both at the global level, national, regional levels. So I think we should, the question now, of course, is how do you translate that, the good news and the good stories and the hearts and minds from those experiences into an environment as difficult as the Wicket? That is an ongoing question of how you do that, and we all have to work together on that. But I want to make sure that we don't walk away from this thinking that the internet and all those principles are outright rejected around the world. I certainly, that is not the message that we took from this conference.
Thank you very much. On that note, I'm afraid that our time here has come to an end. I would like to again thank the Internet Society chapter of DC. Thank you to UJ Sophia and the College of Arts and Sciences at American University for hosting this event. And thank our panel, the Honorable Terry Kramer, Sally Wentworth, and Harold Feld. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Harold. Enjoyed it, Sally. Thank you. Good discussion.
And I guess I'll see you this afternoon.
I'll see you it's like 4 o'clock?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Laura, thank you very much. Great discussion. Wow. Yeah.
Hey there.
I came straight there. Yeah, I don't think we met. Hi, nice to meet you. Thanks for doing this.
Foolishly did not put it in my pocket.